Welcome to the Worldbuilding Workshop, the companion podcast to the book of the same name. My name is Stephen Slota, your co-author and co-host, and who do I have here with me? What's your name again?
It slices, it dices, this is Trent Hergenrader, your co-author and co-conspirator.
Yes, that's it. Don't forward that one to the FBI. Today we're going to be talking about, what is this, Chapter 7. We're up to 7 already. Okay, Chapter 7, Structures and Substructures. And if you have tuned in to the preceding podcast episodes, you'll know a little bit about this system we've been hawking at you, world building among students or learners for the purposes of educating their critical thinking and empathy abilities. So this specific chapter takes that last chapter we talked about, breadth and depth or scope and sequence, and it starts to put some contours on the world that you're starting to model or deconstruct. And to do that, we use the system Trent devised and turned into a card deck as well as a prior book about collaborative world building. That system gets applied to the world you're modeling, and it becomes the job of the learner to examine all of these various substructures, structures, and substructures that can then be used to describe the social forces of the world they are examining. So that's sort of a big picture breakdown of all of this, but rather than me talking about the system you created, why don't we have you talk a little bit about the various structures, substructures, and why you picked those structures, not other structures.
This is exactly the case, and I've only been doing this a million times over my lifetime since working on this project, so I can do it sort of off the top of my head. So the idea here is that we've got 4 structures, and underneath them are, in this basic system, are either 3 or 4 substructures. And I just want to run through...
That's each, right? It's not
each total. Of them. Yeah, so it's 14 total. And this is where, too, that number isn't completely arbitrary, but it also is not fixed in stone. So again, like, this is a recurring theme. Move this stuff around, do whatever you want with it, and I'll explain sort of the rationale when I get through sort of the explanation. And this is something, too, in the book I talk a little bit about, that you can either talk about these quantitatively or qualitatively in terms of describing what you're seeing, or you could use, like in the collaborative world building, you use a numeric system 1 to 5. And in my own experience, having done this across lots of different domains, what I find is people are really good at using the numbers for fictional worlds, for science fiction and fantasy and things that are very distant, and they tend to not like the numbers as much. The numbers are really sort of all threes. They're always sort of in the middle. People don't like to commit to saying, like, oh, I think that race relations is a 2 or whatever, right? So I think that one of the strategies that we will use and can use, and talk about this in the book, is thinking about, because it doesn't matter whether you're using the numbers, the quantitative or the qualitative, the descriptions. The idea is there are features of the world that either, hey, I see a lot of this, or I don't see much of it at all, and then all of sort of the stages in between. So if someone said, well, I think religious influence is strong, right, in this world, not using the quantitative, I think it's really, really strong, then the question is, well, what makes you say that? Right? And it's like, oh, well, there's a different church on every corner, right? And I think my parents live in South Carolina. I've been a northerner my entire life. And when I go down there, I notice there are so many ads for churches, and there's churches on every corner. And it's just different than it is in the north, right? So that's one of those things where I would say, hey, if I was using numbers, I would say it's a 4 or a 5. Like, religion is quite important to this community that they live in. But, if I wasn't using the numbers, then I would just say, oh, well, the fact that it comes up regularly in conversation between people, that you see, so it's that kind of thing, and we'll spend this hour, and change or whatever, sort of running through the different examples, either historical examples, contemporary examples, movies, TV, games, whatever we get around to, and we're kind of, it's one of those things that every world has all of them, and then on top of that. So every world has all of them, but then specific worlds are going to be stronger or more prevalent or weaker or less prevalent. So it's hard to find a world where all of them are super prevalent, because it just doesn't sort of exist. So anyway, let me run through. So the governance is government presence, which again is just how much do you see the government at play in daily life. And we can talk too about what these strategy, or what these terms mean, and some of the criticisms, sort of like, constructive criticisms that I've received at conferences over the years as well. Second one is rule of law, which is sort of the robustness of the justice system, policing, criminal courts, these laws, those kinds of things. The third is social services, which would include things like education, healthcare, transportation, those kinds of things that the government generally supplies through taxation. So that's governance. Economics is economic strength, just how much wealth is in this world, how much available wealth is there. And then secondly, how is that wealth distributed? So you can have a world in which there is tons of wealth and it is highly unequal. There is tons of wealth, it is equally distributed. There is very little wealth and it is very well distributed, that everybody is poor. Or it's very poor, but there happens to be a kingpin or something like that, right? So it's not well distributed. And then the last category, and this is one too, where it's already cheating, which I'll get to in a second, is economics and trade, or is agriculture and trade rather. So even in this system, I tend to think about it as sort of natural resources, trade balance, trade deficit, whatever. And I'll talk about why they're sort of combined. And it may make sense for you to break them apart depending on your project. Social relations, and this is also, you can kind of swap out the word equality for relations as well. So race relations or levels of racial equality, class relations and class equality, gender relations and gender equality, and then sexual orientation and identity relations and sexual orientation and identity levels of equality, right? So these are kind of self-explanatory if you think about them. If you're a certain race or a certain gender or of a certain class, could you get this job? Could you live in this neighborhood, right? Those are all the kind of things where, the classic thing is no one is looking at your eye color when they're determining whether you should or shouldn't get a bank loan, right? Like that's just something we don't care about. And we can imagine worlds in which some of these categories don't matter at all, and then some of them can be very oppressively unequal, right?
And then some of them you could. You're saying in terms of the presence or absence of those particular kinds of equity.
Yeah.
See, because in addition to that, I would say, we'll talk more about this later, but you can create additional categories if
exactly.
they matter for your world. Because under the umbrella of social equity, I would say like disability. And I know there's another version of this that includes like ageism or
exactly.
age, that sort of thing. So anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's fine. Because that's what these are. I had some notes that are the things that I commonly will swap in and out. And then finally, the cultural influences, religious influence, military influence, technology influence, and arts and culture influence. So those are the 4 areas for culture. Those are the 14 across the board. Now, the reason why it's 14, this is going back to, if you've been listening, going back to the sort of like gameful aspect of this. What I hit on, I was playtesting this for a number of years, and the idea was I want a system that can be the default system where you don't swap anything out, and you can talk about the world of the French Revolution, and you can talk about the world of Harry Potter or whatever it is, right? Like whatever media, and all of these things will be present, right? And then this is where, too, like there are obviously things that you can add to this, but it starts to tip over to being too cognitively sort of overwhelming for one. And then the second part is I tried this with dice. I tried this with numbers from 1 to 10. And, it was like, oh, well, what really is the difference between a 7 and an 8 or a 6 and a 7? So the 1 to 5 allows you to sort of dial into, it seems like a bigger jump from a 2 to a 3 than say a 7 to an 8, right? So it just was too granular.
Relatedly, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off again, but it just reminded me that when you initially developed the system, you and I had a lot of conversations about what is the best way to do this, I guess, the optimal way to kind of organize it so that it's both practical, but also forces you to have some of these interesting conversations. And I remember there was a version where it was 1 to 5, but we tried to spell out what each of those numbers actually was. Exactly. So I remember specifically the ones with equity were actually pretty straightforward because it was just totally prevalent or completely absent. Like there wasn't a lot of gradation or a lot of firm striation between those things. But for some categories like government, I remember us having that debate about, well, is a 5 totalitarianism and a 1 anarchy? Like, how do you, what if you do have a hippie commune where everybody is equal or that everybody is provided for? Like, it's present in your life. The government's present in your life, but maybe it's not the same as a totalitarian regime. Exactly. So why would how do you decide which one ends up being the 5 then? Because it seems like you're actually having this multi-dimensional conversation about a thing that you're trying to make one planar
Yep.
explanation of things. So like, how
Yep.
do you think about that? How did you decide the numbers were the just the numbers themselves without that categorization were a better approach?
Yeah, so this is where too, like what I've discovered is because the names of the categories have changed, and I'm still of two minds whether the social relations should be social equality, but then again, like it's multidimensional. And the point of this, and surprisingly, I've never had anybody sort of say this, is that isn't this sort of like overly simplistic or whatever it is, and maybe it's because I'm
Hmm.
always couching it in these terms, that what I discovered as I was dealing with the language and dealing with the numbers is the less that you give people in terms of prescriptive advice as to how to understand this,
Hmm.
then
Hmm.
they are more interested in coming up with their own conception, right? And this is built into the process. This is why it is better to be collaborative. Is that if we're talking about government presence, and I'm thinking, hey, hippie commune, that would be really great if the government was really involved to a degree in which everybody could understand what was needed and whatever. And you're like, oh, I was thinking about a five as being a totalitarian sort of dictator. You have to get all of your papers signed or whatever. If we are working on a project together, we share those ideas, and then we have to work through, well, what do we want to do in this case, right? Both of those are perfectly
Hmm.
valid. Whereas if it's totalitarianism, there's no opportunity for anyone to take a
Sure.
positive, right? Like it's except for the totalitarian, there is nobody who's really on board. Like, oh yeah, that would be a positive, right? So that's where, especially for, and this is one of the things too that I've gotten into discussions for people who are very religious. And if religious influence is a five, this is the kind of thing that'll happen in the world building class. Is that, oh, it must be oppressive, it must be like a theocracy or whatever. And people who have deeply held religious beliefs, like, well, why isn't that great? Why isn't a five great, right? Like, why isn't it that this is something that is everyone is being mindful? And I'm always saying, hey, look, the numbers are not good and bad. They're just numbers, right?
Yeah.
And this is where I think the one for me, the social relations, having a lack of race relations, having a lack of class relations, right? Or, high levels of inequality. It's really, really hard to put a spin on that makes it positive. And you don't also want to make it a complete absence, because if it's a complete absence, then why even use it, right? Like it shouldn't
Hmm.
even be there. Unless you're going to say like, oh, well, race relations, there was never this one race in this place until they showed up, and now they've got to deal with it, right? You know what I mean? Like that could be something where it's like a massive shock to the system. Some of the other things too, I'll just throw this out there and then we can kind of riff on this a little bit. So age and ableism are two of the other ones that I've often used for the social relations. Foreign relations is quite common for the governance. If you're thinking about how a country or a place positions itself vis-a-vis its neighbors. And then, for the more science fictional or speculative, is there magic in the world? Is there non-humans, whether that would be like elves and dwarves and orcs, or whether that would be aliens, AI, Martians, whatever.
Hmm.
Attitudes towards the natural world, like is the natural world something to be revered and left as unspoiled as possible, or is it seen as a natural resource to be harvested, right? So those are some of the other things. And then the agriculture, trade deficit, there's lots of other things. So this is a good template to start. The other thing that I've noticed for people who over years of doing this is that if you want to do this and you want to add magic, like a fantasy world has magic, has the different species, has all these different things, do the 14 first and then add magic and then
Hmm.
add non-species and then add, right, and then so it's working within the entire thing, because this is the, if you're going to make a change, so this is one of the other things too, is regardless of whether the values are numeric or narrative, quantitative or qualitative, the idea that some of these are in tension, or maybe all of them are in tension, but some of them are changing or people are trying to get them to change, right? So these
Hmm.
are some other things that we would want to isolate and be able to talk about. And I think we've already talked about it a little bit in the our previous episodes. But like currently, the issue over trans rights, trans athletes, trans marriage, all these kind of things, it is a massive tension within the society about those who want to make it go down to a zero where there is no equality, there's no recognition, and those who want to bring it up to a five where it is perfect equality, just like anybody else, right? So that is
Hmm.
one clear cut case. And again, it doesn't matter which side of it you're on. It's something that the society is currently dealing with, right? And it's, again, this is the thing, that we can have differences of opinion about what we can or should, or whether it's right or wrong or whatever. But what's, in my opinion, the technical term is dumb, is to pretend that it doesn't exist at all, right? Where it's like it quite clearly exists, right? Whether you believe, whether you don't believe, right? It clearly exists. So let's at
Hmm.
least talk about it in a way that we can sort of account for those things. So the other last part that I just wanted to throw in here, the 14 categories worked the best with 14 cards when you were shuffling up. So the card deck is two ones, three twos,
Hmm.
four threes, three fours, and two fives. And then the four trending, like that just works out to be consistently through many, many play tests. That worked out better when you have 15 or 16. You'd have a much harder time trying to piece the whole thing together, because the other metaphor that I really like when you're talking about this is if any of these change, if you've got 14 or 16 or whatever it is, if any one of them changes. So let's say, for example, we've got our 14 substructures worked out for governance, economic, social relations, and cultural influence. And the tendency, especially for undergraduate students, is to say, okay, now we're going to add magic. And magic is like the fifth column. And I say, no, it isn't. Magic is the 15th thing that we need to think about. So then the question becomes, how does magic work with government presence? How does magic work with rule of law? How does magic work with social
That's a really
services,
good way
right?
to frame that.
So
Yeah.
every time you're adding a new one, you are adding connections to all of the others. And anytime anything dramatically changes, then it's going to pluck the spider web and the whole thing is going to vibrate, right? And that's where, and this is where the way that we do this when we're doing the cards for a numeric thing is I always say, well, look at the high values, look at the low values. And a real common one is if government presence is a 5 and religious influence is a 5, they say theocracy, right? It's a very common, you know what I mean? It's like, okay, that's fine. And then where all the other ones sort of land, but it's like, okay, what are the things that are weak or not very present or actively being oppressed? What are the things that are, most obvious, whatever? Because if there's things that are being actively repressed or aren't part of the society, and there are things that are very clearly part of the society, well, that's showing you that society's values in the physical world, right? And then that goes to say this is where it filters through when we start getting into the catalog. If you are in a world in which you've got, say, a government and a religion that are both really, really, really strong, then it's quite common that lots of people in their day-to-day life have careers that are either in the government or in religious institutions, the things that you're buying, whatever. It's like that, those things will filter through every aspect of life if they're really heavy duty. So if we're talking about technology focus, right, a technology influence being really, really strong, well, if you go someplace in a country that doesn't have as much money as the United States, not everybody has electronics like they do here, right? Like everybody has computer, cell phone, tablet, you know what I mean? Like whatever, just tons and tons of technology everywhere. Where if you go to other countries, even if they have plenty of money, just other countries don't seem to, value that as much. So you don't see it as much in the world. So yeah, so that's where, going through, you could probably do a show on each of these 4 structures. Hell, you could probably do a show on each of the 14 substructures, right? Just talking about all the various ways that you could think about it. But again, the idea is to build from sort of big and broad and then coming down to the complex. And while you're doing this, thinking like we've been repeating, and it's, worth repeating because you got to keep it in mind. If you're talking about the United States, that's different than if you're talking about where I live, right? It's a different, I'm going to go back on that because I don't want to say exactly where I'm from. So if
I'll bleep it out. I'll bleep it out. It's fine.
Is that what you're going to do?
Maybe. I'm keeping all this in. We're keeping all of this in.
This is good listening. So anyway, the point being is that if you're doing it at a very broad, scoped out, zoomed out level, you're going to be making more general claims, right? So when you're talking about the United States, we know the Northeast tends to be quite secular, and then we know the Southeast tends to be quite devout, right? But then there are pockets within each of those that cut against that. There are individual locations that are sort of the height of that. And then you're also talking about, okay, well, what does that mean when you're talking about the United States as a whole? And that's where you're like, oh, well, some people are quite religious and some people are quite secular, right? You know what I mean? That's as good as it gets when you're talking about sort of a nation. And again, this is this whole idea of like, if you're thinking about it using the Google map or the digital map, where are you zooming in? What are you going to be able to say about it, right? And then like, what are we going to be able to sort of argue about, or whose perceptions? And is this because we're too zoomed in or too far out, or whatever you have? But this is again where the structure of all of this, from the scope and sequence, like we talked about last time, to then these structures. You need to be on the same page with whoever is working on the project, right? Everybody needs to understand exactly what they're talking about. So if you've got like a global city, like a London or New York City or whatever, right? We know that those cities are many, many little pockets of cities. All, you know what I mean? It's like a mass of different neighborhoods. But then again, London is different than, say, Beijing in some important ways, right? You know what I mean? So it's you can still make some generalizations that hold true, but then just thinking about, okay, well, where can we say it starts to get to the point where it's like, well, there's this exception and this exception and this exception. And it's like, okay, well, then it's probably not a generalizable statement if there's all of these exceptions to it.
One of the things I kept thinking as you were talking is about the this is more of a media development or narrative or storytelling thing, but the concept of show don't tell.
Yeah.
And that often when you are going through this process, when you're evaluating a particular world, whether that is fiction or nonfiction, really what you want to be thinking about is what does this world show, even if it doesn't tell me that that is explicitly true. And the example I'm going to pick, I don't think anyone will have seen this or very few people, but there's a movie called The Creator released in 2023.
Hmm.
The short version is just that there's a war between AI and humanity, very a la The Matrix. In this particular case, humans are afraid that AI has generated some world-ending device that they think of as being a super weapon. I'm going to spoil the movie. So if you really care about the ending of The Creator, don't. It's not even really the ending. You kind of figure this out in the early part of the movie, but that the super weapon that the AI has developed is love. That the AI has developed the ability to understand the human conception of love. It is expressed through this child AI I was going to call it a monstrosity. It's not. It is a small child that looks human but is AI. And so I mean, there's a whole bunch of interesting technological angles here, but
Hmm.
the thing I really wanted to emphasize is that there is a part of this movie, also toward the end, where even though there is no time spent on exposition about the relationship between religion and all of the other substructures as world built into this specific story, they show you that there is a monastery of AI or a monastery of robots that practice their own religion. And
Hmm.
so, even though they don't actually spend time describing what that religion is or how it functions, there are a lot of visual cues that sort of highlight, okay, this is sort of like a Buddhist monastery, or these are monks, these are robot AI monks. And I can draw some inferences about how religion interfaces with this world just based on the fact that I can see this thing on the
Right.
screen,
Right.
even though it's apart from the rest of the story. It tells me something about the richness of this world, or that at least the creator of the creator
Hmm.
thought about how would religion be inflected through this society where humanity and AI are at odds with each other? What does it mean that there is this group of AI that are removed from the rest of the AI hive mind that have developed their own religion or that they have their own practices? And what does religion mean to those individuals?
Hmm.
What is worship like if you're an AI derived robot? And so it really just introduced a lot of interesting questions about the interrelationships between the substructures. And I find it to be sort of a useful vehicle to talk about, like, if you're having a group of learners go through this world building exercise, that you want them to do show, don't tell. Like, don't
Right.
just have the characters say out loud if they're role playing or if they're writing this is how this part of the world works. Have them figure out where in the environment can I do some of that storytelling or some of the heavy lifting. Or maybe here's where I'm going to intentionally leave a question mark for the reader or the
Right.
audience to think about how might that work, because maybe that's part of the thematic purpose of this to begin with. If I'm doing this as an artistic endeavor, maybe I want my audience to be asking that question for themselves. And so you can kind of strategically use these substructures to decide what is the goal of this project? What is the thing I really want my learners to take away from it? Or what is the thing I want them to build? What parts do we want to put emphasis on because it's
Hmm.
really important to explain something thematically to whatever our audience is? And if there is no public audience or there is no direct audience that you're building this for, what are the things you're most interested
Yeah.
in this world that do express that tension? And I used the example, I think I pulled this from you at some point over the last 15 years, but this idea of I'm going to do the world building, and just as an exercise, as a discussion based exercise for the class, let's just pick a person and drop them into that part of the world. What are they
Right.
going to observe? What are they going to perceive? What are they going to be thinking about? If they're this kind of person, are they going to perceive these things as idyllic, or are they going to perceive it as a threat? And for them, and this goes back to what you were saying earlier about the totalitarian favoring totalitarianism, right? Like
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
fascists love this one weird trick, but like imagine that you drop somebody into that world. Well, if they're at the top of the hierarchy, they're probably going to love that. And so if
Right.
that's the case, what does that say about their perception of the society or their perception of the world they've been dropped into? Likewise, if you are focusing on the world of a bunch of rats that live in the sewers of New York City, like what are the things they're going to value about their social hierarchy and the way that the world is constructed and whatever their government structure is. I'm just kind of
Yeah.
like thinking, I guess, about Fievel. You remember that animated movie?
Yeah.
I think it's
Yeah.
Don Bluth, right? Like whatever. Like thinking about the society that this kind of caricature would fit in, and what would they feel like. The way I used to talk about this is when I said it to my students is, let's imagine we took somebody from three generations ago and dropped them into our classroom right now? Like, what would
Yep.
they observe? What would they think? What would they feel? Why might they feel that way? Would they feel scared? Would they feel enthusiastic? And it could be both or either. Like, and it really depends on what is the minority or majority in any particular cultural social category that's going to dictate that outcome. But at
Hmm.
least it gives you some initial frame of reference to think about how does the world feel to a person that has
Right.
been placed in it? And then can I
Right.
use that frame of reference to figure out what some of this negotiating over the various substructures should look like?
Right, right. Yeah, exactly. And that's where too, like going back, I think I talked last time about Star Trek, and that's a classic, it's a TV show that had, weekly episodes. The ship as a culture and as a,
Hmm.
hierarchy is stable. Everybody knows Kirk is on top, or whatever captain that you want to use or whatever. Everyone has
Hmm.
well-defined roles, and no one's trying to, upset. At least I'm not a huge Star Trek fan, but no one's really ever trying to upset the equilibrium of the Enterprise. But what it does is every week it goes and investigates some new world, some new phenomenon, something, in which it's like,
Hmm.
wow, what if we took a couple of these and really like sort of turned them on their heads or really made them extreme, and all these kinds of
Hmm.
things. And then they run through, well, what would people who are, their sort of the crew of the Star Trek Enterprise are us? You know what I mean? Like we think
Yeah.
that they're normal, we understand where they're coming from. So we see their confusion, we see their fears or their, admiration or whatever it is. So we're always processing the world through those sorts of character
Hmm.
perspectives. Another thing I was going to say too, that a couple comments that I'd gotten, one from Carol Murphy and Evan Turner at the Frontiers for Playful Learning at UConn a couple years ago. Both of them said, and I think quite rightly, that lots of pre-colonial cultures, indigenous cultures, these categories wouldn't make sense, right? They did not
Hmm.
have their world. They didn't operate this way where they saw gender or they saw, sexual orientation or government or things like that. And I say that's a very fair point, but I'm not teaching those people, right? Like the people in the room who I'm going to be teaching are going to think about sort of rigid structures and things like that. And like, I could accept that if somebody says, "Hey, look, a tribal council of elders is not really what they would have called governance in the same way." And it's like, that's
Hmm.
fine. How else would we, that's fine then. Then how else would we represent that using this system? Is there something else that we could add? Because there's some voice that has authority that says, this is what we're going to do, right? If there's a problem, if there needs to be some sort of resolution between a disagreement, every society has some way, and it may be rotating, right? There are people who you've got a different chief or chieftain every season, right? Like there's varieties of ways of doing it, and they may have thought about it in different ways. But we're in the 21st century. Our students are in the 21st century, and this is something too that we'll get into even more so because this is something this piece that
Hmm.
I'm working on right now. Trying to capture all of this in language is a
Hmm.
big part of the task, right? In images, I always liked one of the ideas that I cribbed from you was mood boards. What are the kind of things that you could find, images you could find on the internet, or color
Hmm.
palettes that would kind of represent this? So that's speaking to a different kind of literacy, like a visual literacy of what would the world look and kind of feel and maybe smell like when you're moving through it. Of course, I'm trying to
Hmm.
do that in creative writing through language. And I would ask them to then turn around and try and capture those feelings and sensations in language. But this is
Hmm.
where that real trying to find, well, I don't really mean totalitarian. I mean, you know what I mean? It's like, oh, well, tell
Hmm.
you what, find a word for it. And if it's speculative, then make up a new word for it, right? Or whatever
Hmm.
it kind of is. But that's where, again, the system I always use, and I want to find a better sort of metaphor, but I always think that there's some sort of scaffolding that as the building goes up, the scaffolding comes down. You don't need it anymore, right? And this is
Hmm.
especially true when you're working with the numeric quantities. It does not take very long for everyone to just kind of forget. Like these are just low, right? These are just things that are not that important in the world, and
Hmm.
these are the pressure points. These are the things that are driving potential change in the world, and it can be driving middle numbers to be growing or shrinking. It could be, one of the extremes, a five that is dropping rapidly, or a one that is increasing rapidly, right? But any of these things. So, another thing too is to get back into the away from the world of fiction and into the world of things that actually happen would be like a climate disaster, right? Or like a
Hmm.
hurricane. Hurricane Katrina hits New Orleans. Well, what did it look like? How would you model the world a week before Katrina hits? And then how would you
Hmm.
model the world a week after Katrina hits, right? Like there's going to be, it may be changing rapidly, but if you just want to take a snippet of time, how would you, what was the government presence in New Orleans in the days immediately following Katrina, right? That doesn't need to be a totalizing statement because you're not trying to talk about New Orleans for all time. You're just like, okay, in the wake of this very specific disaster, and it would have been different. Was it if it would have been a tornado or a different kind of disaster?
Sure.
You
Yeah.
would have a different response, right? So just thinking through those kinds of things that have happened, we have hard data on what you can find out about a before and after. A volcano blows up, or there's an earthquake, or whatever, or if a dictator comes to power. Not that we know any countries where that's happened, but if somebody immediately comes to power, or there's a revolution, or in a speculative sense, dropping nuclear weapons, or there's what is it, an EMP? Is that what it is that disrupts all?
EMP. Yeah.
EMP, yeah, right. So what is it? What is the world like if we took away all of our electronics for a week? What would we do? That's funny too, and this is a little bit of a sidebar, but I think it's a good thing to think about in terms of the time of world building. This is more last episode than this one. But I remember when I was at my job at the U.S. Soccer Federation in 1997, it would have been, the power went out and everybody was helpless because we couldn't use our computers. Right. And this is at a time in which we all shared an AOL account and we had to ask permission to get online. Right. Because there was a limited number of accounts or whatever. And people were bemoaning, oh, well, 10 years ago, I wouldn't have even thought about using a computer. I do everything by hand. Right. And now it's crazy that if the internet is down, everybody freaks out. I can't get on the internet. I can't possibly do anything. And it's like, what? You've still got all of the computing power. You just can't connect to the internet. And again, it's like, as you were saying, we were born at a time in which we can very clearly see what life was like before and what life was like after. I always find this funny too that my students always say, like, when we come up with a post-apocalypse, the first time I did it with Hell Walkie, they were like, what if there was no internet? Right. And that was like, they're like, oh, I can't even imagine. And this is, 2011 or whatever. I'm like, hey, everybody, just to be clear, the majority of my life, I did not have the internet and it was not an apocalypse. Right. It's like nobody even knew. Right. That we didn't have it. So yeah. So again,
But think of what they were missing out on.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
they could be living in this.
Right.
Gesturing broadly.
Gesturing broadly. Exactly. So again, it's just one of those things to be thinking about. And again, I don't want to get too, I feel like we're either talking forward or talking back. But one of the things too, that as time has gone on, I get more and more interested in is the sense of living memory. And, young people don't tend to see why social change is such a big deal because they've only been on the planet for 11 years, right? It's like, why, who cares if we think about, gay rights or whatever. And it's like, well, I've been, and then the older guard, I've been on this planet for 70 years, and it's like, and I'll drop dead before it changes, right? So it's those kind of things too. Or the mind-blowing fact that none of my incoming students were alive during 9/11. Like, that's just such a major event for me in my life, right? And I'm sure for many listeners. But for them, it's not even anything, they don't even have a memory of it because they were born after the event, right? So that was an interesting sort of temporal time switch and what you can reference. And then again, thinking about, looking back, it's like, well, we've always been worried about terrorism. This country has always been worried about terrorism, right? Because there were hijackings were a big thing in the 70s or whatever. But then you can't understand the United States in the 21st century without understanding 9/11, right? Like you just can't. It's affected absolutely everything. And this is where our government presence, our rule of law, like you just run through the whole thing and be like, what was it on November or September 10th? And what was it on September 13th? Right. I mean, like it's, or whatever you want to do. The world changes. Right. And then another thing that I think is really important to emphasize is that this is also all 14 of these categories are all human made, human institutions, and human enforced. Right. So if we're talking about race relations, class relations, gender relations, right? Economics, governance, culture, right? So if I am from a minority class, a minority gender, and the minority religion, I could go in and ask for a bank loan and get denied based on any one or two or all three of those things because, and then that limits my ability to participate in the economy in the way that I wish to. And if I have a grievance about that, who do I go to? I go get a lawyer who then says, we're going to take this to court. And then the legal system, rule of law takes over, right? So it's like, and it's the same thing. Like the separation of church and state is not a universal thing in all nations. A lot of nations do have the church and state combined. Basically, the religious documents and the founding principles of the government are very intertwined, right? So it's like those are the cases in which, the founding fathers and the people that built the United States did not want that to happen, but other places it's different. And then I remember last time I was in Spain, I was talking about that, and I can't remember, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. But yeah, the Spanish church still is very deeply intertwined with benefits it receives from being part of from the Spanish government, right? So just thinking about how all of these things again would affect who's the outsider in the world. One of the things too that I always like to talk about when we're talking about the structures and substructures, because again, it's the anti woke politically correct thing where it's like, look, if we have a world, who would it be great to be born, right? We've got that statement, someone's born on third base and they think they hit a home run or whatever, right? We
Yeah.
can just say, hey, look, if your parents are multimillionaires or whatever it is, or you're really well off and blah, 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 your life might not be easy, but you're not going to have a lot of the same obstacles as somebody who is from an impoverished background, only
Hmm.
one parent, limited access to education, limited access to any of these other things, right? If you just ask somebody, and this is often why using speculative worlds, fictional worlds, it's easier for people to put themselves in other people's shoes in a fictional world because then they don't have the tendency to want to think about what the ramifications for that in our world. It's much easier to be like, oh, we want to have a great social revolution so there are no poor people, and it's like, okay, well, how about now? You want to give 40% of your salary? You know what I mean? To we could do that right now. It's like, oh, well, this is just a simulation. This is just this is just a fictional world or whatever. But yeah, but thinking about who would it be great to be? Who would have a really hard time? Who would have a number of vectors if you're a minority group in a number of these, right? And it can just be too, like when I go to Spain, well, I'm not, the majority of people are Spanish and the first language is Spanish. And I'm in the minority when I go there, right? As a privileged white guy. But there are moments where you can find yourself where you're going to be the minority, right? Or even just going into certain cities. They can go into certain neighborhoods in Rochester that are almost entirely black, right? And I would be the minority in that world that we're in that moment. So, just thinking about how, I think it's the William Gibson quote, the future technologies will arrive, but they will arrive unevenly, or something. I'm probably misquoting that, right? The future will arrive, but it will arrive unequally. And just thinking about how these social forces roll out and how they're seen, and again, where they came from, how long it's been a thing. Is this something that's new, or is this something that's centuries old, right? All these kinds of questions. And really, this is where you, as the instructor, you leading the world building thing, and this is also why you can do all this stuff by yourself in seclusion, but it's a lot harder to get. Number one, you cannot get the same level of viewpoints because you're always limited by just your own imagination, right? So just adding a second person in gives you a wealth of different things, different ideas, experiences to draw from, which is also a very constructionist kind of, social learning kind of thing, right? But if you've got a group of people who are doing this, you could theoretically do this forever, right? And still be weeding through. So, we'll come up with this when we start getting into the stuff in a few episodes on how you actually manage this. How much time do you want to give over to working through some of these questions? How much instruction do you want to give to spell out what these things mean? Or do you want them really to just, have to jump in at the deep end and figure it out for themselves? If you're only going to be doing this for a couple classes, you want to do more at the front end, right? Give them more stuff. And if you're going to be having a longer 3-week, month-long, semester-long project, there's a lot more time to say, hey, this is going to be a messy, weird conversation with lots of fits and spurts and stops and starts. And that's just the way it goes. That's just the way it's going to be, right? So again, there's not a right way. There's not a wrong way. I would argue there probably are better and worse ways, right? Like trying to do too much too fast is going to result in lots of generalizations, right? That's what ends up happening is we don't have time to develop this culture. So we're just going to say they're all really mean or whatever it is, right? You know what I mean? And it's like, okay, well, it's better to have not had that representation at all rather than having like a really lazy kind of stereotype, even if it's a fictional kind of category. All right, well, I said a whole bunch. You got to be thinking about something. Tell
Well,
me.
you'd be surprised.
will.
The thing I kept coming back to as you were talking was the actually slice some of these categories depending on what it is you're trying to deconstruct. And again, I want to specify for anyone listening that this is not meant to be a series of moral judgments about any of these things. Like I know you were saying earlier that with respect to total inequity of race relations or total inequity of gender relations, like there is, I think, some inherent moral spin on that. Like
Yep.
it is if you're making the argument that we should be segregated based on some characteristic, like that's probably not great. Like,
Right, right.
I don't want to say in every case, I don't know, but as a surface level evaluation of that, it's probably a worse thing if there is less equity, right? Like,
Right, right.
and so we can stipulate that there are outliers, but when you're going through this process with your learners, you want to be really careful that they don't equate the numbers themselves to being good or
Good or
bad.
bad,
Like
right?
there is no, five is good and one is bad, or vice versa.
Right.
That you actually want them to be thinking dynamically about this. And as you kind of pointed out, the purpose of it is to peel this off as time goes on. Like
Right.
spend less
Right.
time worrying about the
I was just gonna say too, and then sometimes this is I think this is really amazing. I'm wearing an Adirondacks t-shirt. I go to the Adirondacks quite a bit, and it's a fascinating place because there's people who are like hippie, crunchy conservation, environmentalists, and then you've got people who are like hunters and fishermen
Mhm.
and whatever. So it's like, and they've got to negotiate all the time development, and there's schools, right? There's people who live there year round. It's not like a national park, and it becomes this space in which all of these things are being negotiated all the time, and everybody
Mhm.
has to find solutions because they all live there, right? And it's one of those things where it's like, you can't be a not in my backyard or whatever because everybody is living in that environment. But I was just thinking that there is a gas station that I stopped at that from one summer it had a men's room and it had a women's room, and the next summer they had bathroom, right? They just said they've got the same exact thing. Just put a tampon dispenser in both of them. Put a baby changing table in both of them, and it says on the door, "We don't care what you are. Just wash your hands." Right? And it's like, okay, well, that's a way of being like, what is the purpose of having one bathroom that only one gender can use, and another bathroom that only another gender can use? And, they've got the physical infrastructure that it didn't matter, right? It wasn't like you had to
Mhm.
walk into a room or whatever. But that's just another way of being like, are you wasting time? And I think there's a difference between spending time and wasting time. Are you wasting time on things that are irrelevant? And this is one of the dangers. I write about this more in fictional world building. Dangers of like just going on one thread and taking it to the end of the earth, right? And it's like, again, with these projects, this is where you as the instructor need to be thinking about how much time you've budgeted for each one. And I always say, my funny example that I've said a million times is if you're getting deep into the accounting practices of elves and their annual auditing process, right? Unless your main hero is an accountant, you're probably going too far, right? Like, would they need one? Sure. Is anybody ever going to care? No, right? So it
Right.
was
Well,
like,
that's the thing I was going to say is so I've been thinking about there have been a couple of different examples that have come to mind as you've been talking. And so one of them specifically regarding race relations is The Expanse, which is a science
yeah,
fiction
which is great.
series. It's very good. And the main differentiator between humans is not race or gender. It's where in the solar system are you from? Are you an Earther? Are you a Belter, which is somebody who lives in the asteroid belt? And there are a variety of interesting dynamics there. And then are you a Martian, which is a sort of militaristic society that has sprung off from Earth but is still human, right? And the thing that separates them, the politics of that world, the world of the expanse, is driven by the conflict over who controls the resources of Earth versus the asteroid belt versus Mars. And then, I mean, there's more to it than that, but
Right.
that is an easy way to differentiate these populations and why they are in conflict. And so, if you're thinking about world building, what is the effect of that? Well, if you're a belter, you're probably poor relative to the other societies that exist. And in addition to that, you have a bunch of actual physical limitations as a result of growing up and living in zero gravity. So
Right.
one of the things The Expanse does particularly well, I think, relative to other media, is that it has a pretty coherent grounding in actual physics. Like
Yeah, it does. It's
it
great.
attends to the consequences of zero gravity living. It attends to the how quickly you could travel in space, right? There's these massive distances between these things. It takes time. What happens if you have a mechanical failure on your ship that actually has lethal consequences, right? So the world is constructed around those ideas. It is not focused on what does a traditional sort of race division look like. And so I think that there's an opportunity to emphasize that when you're talking about a world or deconstructing a world with your learners, they can be having a conversation about which of these things actually matters in the world that we're talking about without diving into dynamics that probably are going to be irrelevant, as you pointed out with accounting. Like, I
Yep.
don't really care what Tolkien thought about the accounting of the elves. Like, I don't think
Right.
anyone's reading that book. But also, the more you go into detail on all of these things, this is the second point I wanted to make, the more detail you go into with any given substructure, the more complexity you're going to have to account for. And because there are no actual constraints on this thing, unless you're
Hmm.
talking about a real world situation where you're modeling the world we live in or the world of the past for which we have thorough documentation, right?
In some
If you're
cases, yeah. I mean,
in
in
some
many
cases,
cases
not
we
all of
don't,
them.
right?
Right. I wanted to just specify those where we have a
Yeah.
lot of
Yeah. Yeah.
data, right? That's different than diving all the way into one specific substructure and then finding yourself writing a Gordian knot where now you're never going to get out of it because you're going to have
Right.
to explain how does this thing work with the rest of society,
Right.
the rest of
Right.
civilization. And the one that came to mind was, and this is because I just wanted to make a dig at J.K. Rowling and her schlocky writing, but
Yep.
the fact that when people started asking her to expand on the world of Harry Potter, she went into too much detail about some of this stuff that then raised a ton of questions about how does the rest of this world cohere? Because,
Right.
for example, she
George Lucas would like to
specified.
have a word.
Yeah, well, I mean, so let's use those as two contrasting cases, right? Like that in J.K. Rowling's case, she ended up specifying that during the Middle Ages, wizards would just go to the bathroom wherever they were standing and use their wands to wizard away the excrement they left on the floor, which I
Wi-
guess calling back to our communities of
Whiz
practice.
away. Yeah.
Yeah, whiz away, wizards. Yes,
Yeah.
thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Everyone kind of looked at that and went, well, you knew there were toilets then, right? Like that humans had figured this out and they didn't just go wherever. And so like
Right.
that raised a bunch of questions of like, how do you think your own world that you
Yep.
invented functions?
Right.
And then compare that with George Lucas, who basically said, I don't care.
Yeah.
I'll
Yeah.
invent whatever and we'll just go with it. And so there are simultaneously a ton of contradictions in the way that J.K. Rowling approached creative writing versus the way George Lucas did, which
Yep.
also is full of
Which
contradictions,
is, yeah, exactly.
but for very different reasons. And
Right.
so there's our favorite post, I think, the post describing the way the Star Wars fandom operates, that everyone loves Glup Shido, right? Like there's this one character that, everybody can rally around because Glup Shido has made an appearance somewhere. Well, the way that George Lucas constructed that reality, leaving aside all of the scientific and physical problems with how he characterizes light speed and all of
Yeah.
this other stuff, or lasers, or the way space battle works, there's just all these contradictions based on the fact that he over stereotyped a lot.
Right.
And as a result, now there's a bunch of questions about like, okay, well, you very clearly made the Trade Federation run by Koreans based on the bad accents you
Right,
included
right.
for those aliens. So like, what are you actually talking about when you talk about the economics of Star Wars? And this actually gets a really interesting point. And you and I have talked about Andor a number of times already on this podcast, and I don't want to dive too much in because I feel like that is a hyper specific example, but
Right.
different directors who had different levels of interest in different parts of the Star Wars universe have actually done a pretty good job of taking the pieces that work and trying to analyze or comport them in such a way that you can tell a really compelling story about the systems of the Star Wars galaxy, about the structures and substructures of the Star Wars galaxy, without getting lost in the weeds of what George Lucas set up, right?
Yeah.
So you can carve off your own little piece of this and focus on the structures that actually make sense for the themes or the story you want to tell. Our argument, I think, and this is me putting words in your mouth, is just that when you're doing this process with learners in your environment, whatever it happens to be, you as the facilitator or the instructor, your job is basically to make sure that the learners aren't going down this sort of either one of those bifurcated paths where you're on one of the J.K. Rowling end of the spectrum or the George Lucas end of the spectrum. You kind of just want to manage this so that the students are getting an idea of the complexity without ultimately digging themselves a hole they then can't get out of.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I was thinking too, as you were talking, going back to another real world example that I'm quite familiar with, the Al-Andalus example, is that, a lot of our, and I'm not an expert on this, so, who knows if I'm 100% correct or not, but our contemporary notions of race are overwhelmingly informed by the slave trade, right? So in the years prior to the slave trade kicking off in the 15th century, really it's sort of the 15th, 16th century, in the world of Al-Andalus, the thing that would have mattered was not your skin color, it was your religion, right?
Yeah.
And it's one of those things that if you would have been a different skin color, but you were Christian or you were Jewish or you were Muslim, that's the thing that people cared about, right? And there are tendencies, at this time for people of certain skin colors, certain ethnicities to be certain religions. But that's one of those cases in which you could create a world in which the religious influence is extremely strong. And it's not just one religious influence, right? It's all religions is quite strong, right? It's important to Christians, it's important to Muslims, and it's important to Jewish people. Race relations are not that important at all. Right? I mean, like, that's the way that the world was in, 1200 or something like that. And then that changes very dramatically when you start having slaves being brought to the New World and doing work, right? That became one of those justifications. And that's where, these contemporary notions that we have of people who are being inferior, inferior races, and all that kind of stuff, like, that was not just because of the science and because of the history and all these other kind of things. If you go back far enough in time, those were not things that you would have seen. I mean, there's racism in Shakespeare, right? So you could find traces of these things, but that's us looking back at it, not them looking at it in the moment,
I want to
which is
ask
totally
you
different.
to, yeah, 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 it definitely is. And actually, that gets at something I've wanted to scratch at for a little while, which is how we use this system to evaluate other times and places,
Right,
not
right.
just fictional ones. Specifically, like when we think about authorial intent, when we think about the world an author has created and our deconstruction of that world, whether or not the author would have perceived the world in a particular way, and are we ascribing to them values that would not have existed or been a thought at the time? And
Right,
I was going to
right,
ask you to kind
exactly.
of cook on Tolkien for a minute, because
Yeah,
I feel like that's one where often there is a lot of criticism lobbed at him, but if you look at what was his authorial intent and the context in which he lived, like how would he have thought about gender and race, and how does that inflected in Lord of the Rings, and what
yeah.
are the implications when you're casting a movie or a TV show about that? And maybe this is a good place, actually, we could do a little bit of cross comparison between the Lord of the Rings Peter Jackson movie
Yeah,
versus the
yeah,
text versus the way that Rings of Power by Amazon has been sort of put together.
yeah.
And
I'm flinching. If you're not watching the video, I'm flinching when he says the words "rings of power."
yeah, yeah, well, so to cook on that for a
Yeah, and
second,
I
how
was
do
going
you
to say
think
too.
about that?
I just finished all of the Witcher series, which I'm sure most people who are listening are not that familiar with it. But one of the things that I find is really interesting about it is not high medieval; it's early modern, right?
Mm,
So the world is changing in ways, and there are lots of anachronisms. And George R. R. Martin does this too. Lots of anachronisms, particularly in terms of psychology. In The Witcher, there's a lot about anatomy. They really get into ligatures and things like that. And it's like, okay, well,
mhm,
in the like medicine was not that advanced, but you give them a pass because they're fantasy writers or whatever. It's one of those things I've always said with Arya Stark too. Like her whole notion of identity is not a medieval
mhm,
notion of identity, right? Like that is not how people would have thought about themselves at all. Or the fact that now, even school kids would say, oh, well, you're born into the world as a blank slate. And it's like, okay, well, that's John Locke. And I think he's 17th, 18th century, right? And like nobody had ever thought like that. If they had thought about it, they never used that language. And then
mhm,
this is my philosophy bias showing a little bit when because people are like philosophy. Rah, rah. It's like okay, well you get people who like have an idea like Kant or whoever, and they get it out into the world, and it has this ripple effect where it's like, wow,
mhm,
if that's the way existence is, if that's the way, ontology works, then that changes everything, right? And it's like because
mhm.
we've inherited all of these institutions, all of these cultural ideas, all this kind of stuff. And this is where, people with history of sexuality can go hog wild, right? With no pun intended. But like thinking about how different cultures around the world who have different faiths, different systems, like there is no one man, one woman nuclear family. Like that is another modern human invention, right? And you can say that that is the apotheosis, that is the best, that is the most whatever, but that does not mean that that is the only way or the other ways that lots of different cultures over time have organized themselves not around nuclear family units in single family homes. That is an extraordinarily modern thing. It is the thing that we have all experienced, right? And overwhelmingly
Mhm.
on the planet, that's the way because, it's like that's sort of the mentality with globalization that sort of won out and the both the spread of Islam and Christianity, right, starts to create those kinds of structures. But again, if you just go to the week before, it was very different, right? And people thought very differently, and they weren't sitting around waiting for a truth to be revealed. They were doing whatever made sense for their culture in that moment, and it's always a
Mhm.
combination of the environment, seasonal changes. That's why people, if you're living on a chain of small islands, if you're living in the middle of a desert, right? That's why these cultures change and are so different, is because they're partially about the mix of the people who are there, the environmental conditions, all these kind of things. And then as major world religions start to spread, well, how does that come into contact, right? So again, it's one of those things where the answer to everything in with world building and all of these things is it's always really, really, really complex, right? And you're probably going to only be able to get to a guesstimate of what the real is. Like I
Mhm.
don't think I can talk with no matter however much research, we're only going to be guessing at what a 12th century Chinese peasant would have thought and felt, right? I mean, like we just don't, we just wouldn't know. But we could take some wild guesses as a human being what they might be. But what I was going to say, so one of the things too that really burns my proverbial cheese with Tolkien is, and it's any author, but it's Tolkien in this case because I've done a lot of work on Tolkien and I know who he is. As a man and as a person, one of the things that I always love is that he was a wild guy, He once hijacked a city bus when he was at Oxford and went around on a joyride, right? And everyone's like, "Oh, he's these stuffy old, whatever." And I'm like, "No, he had a wild side to him, right? Which you wouldn't know unless you read his biography or whatever." Also, he came from a pretty poor background. He managed to go to Oxford, and it was all paid for because he was brilliant even at a young age. But it was not that he was coming from an affluent background, right? So sometimes, and you can ask, well, how much of his personal life story can then be read in The Lord of the Rings? And there's a real danger for that too, right? Like you can't assume that he is subconsciously having all of this stuff come up in his work, or maybe he was doing it consciously or whatever, right? But going back to your specific question, I always say that Tolkien is a man very much of his time, of his era, the early part of the 20th century in England, and a hardcore Catholic in a land full of Anglicans, right? So it's like he's on the outside of that picture, right? He is so super Catholic and convinced that, whatever. And he subscribed to sort of Catholic ideology that the mother is like the best. Mary is unbelievable. Mary is like the slightest notch down from being Jesus because she was a virgin, she was a pure, right? And you can say, from contemporary feminist criticism, well, putting a woman on a pedestal like that, and it's like, yes, I agree. Those things are valid, right? But that's not what Tolkien was thinking, right? And this is where one of the things too that specifically with the issue of gender, race I think is a little bit harder, but with gender, he's got stronger female characters, stronger women heroines doing major stuff. You've got Éowyn, you've got Arwen, right? You've got these people who are really, really necessary. Arwen's a great case because she hardly has any lines, right? But if you go through and you read all of the Silmarillion, and Galadriel obviously is another one. I'm hoping for those of us who, Stephen Colbert always laughs about this too. If you don't know these people, then it's like, it makes no sense to you whatsoever. But point being is that he's got these women characters who are among the best, brightest, strongest, most important people in the world. If you do that big kind of demographic analysis, there's just too few of them, right? There are, out of all of the named characters, an overwhelming number are men or male, right? So that is something that I think can be said, well, he wasn't thinking about that, right? And that's not an excuse. And again, this goes back to, we don't need to be, in my opinion, and it's maybe easy for me to say as a straight white guy, whatever, but if you point out that Tolkien got some things wrong about women, that doesn't make him a misogynist, right? Or at least not in the intentional sense that someone like, who's the MMA guy who's, or like
Andrew Tate,
or whatever.
One of those guys, yeah.
These are people who are, that's their identity, is that they are misogynists, right? And they want to get more people to become misogynists, and they want to write misogynist work and share misogynist work because that's their worldview, right? Now, Tolkien is doing, it could be a softer version of misogyny through exclusion, right? And it's unintentional, and that's not the point that he's trying to make, right? So I think we can make a wider cultural criticism that is valid to say, hey, look, it was very... the woman stayed at home. She did the things that she was supposed to do. She had the kids. She took care of the kids, which in that worldview was super important, right? While the man went out to be the breadwinner. And we can say, okay, there's lots of problems with that. But that's the world that Tolkien was living in. And those were the values that he was working with, right? And it's like, it's unfair to then say, okay, in my mind, it's unfair to take the last, 100 years of critical theory, and all this postmodern theory and whatever, and be like, oh, we're going to retroactively apply this to this one guy using his work as like the psychoanalytical couch analysis. And this is where, too, just to throw this in here, mixing too many things in, throwing way too many things in, but this is where Thomas Jefferson, for me, does not get a pass. Right? Thomas Jefferson is on the record in letters saying, like, slavery is really bad, but there's just nothing we can do about it. Right? And it's like he's aware of the contradiction when he's writing, the founding documents. He's totally aware of it. And so is George Washington. They just, in that moment, didn't know how to square that impossible circle of how do you keep this Southern economy alive if you remove slavery, right? And it's like, okay, well, we're having a hard enough time to get on the same page with all this other stuff, so we're just going to put that on the back burner, right? And they can do that because they didn't ask anybody who was from that background. What do you think about what we should be putting into the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution, right? They were not asking women, they were not asking people of color, they were making all of those decisions. But I think that there's some difference there in terms of seeing, and this is one of the things too, people doing great work in feminism. There are women who are speaking up and saying this is unfair. that goes back as long as we've got recorded history, right? I mean, saying like this system sucks, I am being treated unfairly, all those kinds of things. And just because they didn't get, the airtime, the radio play or whatever you want to call it, doesn't mean those ideas didn't exist. It doesn't mean that they didn't feel that way, that somebody would have been happy or proud. And even today, there are women who want to stay at home and let their man be and it's like, okay, well, that's an opinion too. I guess the question would be for someone like me, you want to build a society where it's a choice, right? Where it's a choice that you can do this, where you're not compelling somebody to do it against their will, nor are you compelling somebody, you cannot stay at home and be a homemaker, you must go into the workforce, right? So, again, it works both ways in my mind, and we get to better places as a society if we can be honest about that, right? But the reality is the social forces in the United States that have tried to force women out to get jobs, find me some examples, right? Like basically women having to come to the industrial world to work while the men are off at war is like the only thing I can think of, right? Is the only time when it's like you've got to like enter this other sphere, and it's always like, well, all women must go back to the proverbial kitchen, right? So in terms of like balancing these forces, this is where you get the false equivalence, right? We have these problems, and this is where too, for even people who are on my sort of end of the political spectrum, you get these false equivalences where it's like, well, no one's ever saying women need to leave the kitchen. I'm like, well, okay, no, they haven't. There are periods in which they kind of have, right? You know what I mean? Like we can admit that and just sort of say that's not much better. But still, you can say on the weight of all the examples that we can find. Another great example would be sexualizing people in visual advertisements, magazine advertisements, right? So if you go out and you go to a bookstore and you pull all the magazines off the shelf that are, whatever, and you flip through and you say, okay, which has been, in terms of just sort of examples, can you find examples in which men are sexualized in advertising? Yes, but it's 1 in every 90 for women, right? So you could say it's bad for men, we shouldn't be doing it for men, but just because you find examples of it does not mean that it's the same thing as being just inundated on billboards and on TV and on magazines, right? It's like, you could also, you don't want to be saying, well, that doesn't matter. It's so small, it doesn't even matter. Well, that's not necessarily true either, right? Like it's probably, if we don't sexualize women, we should probably also not be doing that to men. But again, it's one of those things that does not need to be a false equivalence, which again, I think simple thinkers, maybe that's what we should be calling these people instead of fucking idiots, is simple thinkers that, you got to think back through here and be like, okay, wait a minute. If you've got an example of 2 and an example of 98 out of your 100 samples, yes, it exists, but it's not, it happens to all of us, right? It's like, it happens to some of us inordinately more often, and that makes it a problem that we need to address, right? And it's like, it shouldn't be happening to anybody, but, again, there's so many examples of this where we have the false equivalence, and I think the thing that both of you and I use great loads of profanity to talk about is how easy of a tool that is just to be like, it's all the same, right? Like I was, I had a woman say, I had a black woman say to me, well, you white guy, whatever. So that was racist against me, so everything's equal. And it's like, yeah, no, it is, what I mean? Like that is an opportunity to have simple thinking for a complex problem, right? And it's like, reverse discrimination, all these kind of things. It's like, there are instances of that. But when you start looking at the big picture of who is being disproportionately harmed, I'm not going to lose a job over that. I'm not going to lose a promotion over that. You know what I mean? All those kind of things. And that's why it's still, even if someone in a moment would have sort of like, you're not going to get this because of who you are, you're a man or you're white or whatever, right? That wouldn't be great. I wouldn't celebrate that, and be like, oh, we've gotten so far. But on the other hand, it's like, okay, well, that's 1 for me and 17,486,000, you know what I mean, for whoever has historically been marginalized. And it's something that you and I can both see, and this is a project that I do in my world building unit for this large interdisciplinary class that I do, is we can all, through these different categories, find ourselves in the majority and find ourselves in the minority. And if you're somebody like me, you're finding yourself on the more privileged end more often than not. Right. And then there are other people who are finding themselves on this is the concept of intersectionality. They're finding themselves on the underprivileged or the oppressed in a variety of different categories. And if you're a woman who's poor and black, those are 3 areas. That's the intersectionality. Those 3 forces are all creating additional problems for you. Whereas if you're only a woman in black, but you're middle class or whatever, you've got different problems. You know what I mean? It's not to say that those problems don't exist, but there are cases in which as those continue to compound, then you have fewer and fewer options. opportunities, difficulties, all these kind of things. It's just a much harder life. And I think that we, again, this is one of those, just coming back to this, you just got to be honest about it. What you choose to do about it is completely different in my mind.
That's what I was thinking. The whole time you're talking is I think perhaps unexpectedly this kind of circles us back to the learning theory or the design angle of
Yeah.
this, which is like what is the actionability or intentionality of this thing we're doing and why would you want to do world building? This is it. Is
Yeah.
so that you can do the contrasting cases that encourage transfer, right? Like
Right.
not that I want to make this all about me and my area of expertise, but
Yeah.
that's
No,
functionally
exactly.
the purpose of this, right? It's to make sure that the learners in your learning environment, regardless of what it is, the system is agnostic to whether you're doing this in industry or higher ed or K-12
Right.
or military or healthcare or whatever. The reason why we say you should do this or why it's a good practice and it's theoretically supported in a very robust
Right.
way is because it gives you great contrasting cases to make the argument to the learner, hey, here's the invariance, here's the variance, here are the things that you should be thinking about when you go out into the world. And you use, talking about Tolkien or talking about Thomas Jefferson, like the main difference between those cases is that choice. Like, how are you
Yeah,
exerting
exactly.
your agency
Exactly.
as a human in the world? And whether you're talking about historical cases, you're talking about contemporary cases, you're talking about fictitious cases, it doesn't really matter. It's trying to present to your audience or to your learners that they have a say in how they live their lives and that those choices they should be deliberate and they
Right.
should be measured and they should be thoughtful. And so I don't know how much time we have left or
Yeah.
how close
We're at
we're
an hour
coming, but
five, so I mean,
yeah,
we should
so
probably be wrapping it up pretty.
just kind of be circling around.
Yeah.
I would say like compare Tolkien to H.P. Lovecraft, right? H.P.
Right.
Lovecraft was a horrendous racist
He
and
was extremely
anti-Semite. He's a
racist. Yeah.
terrible person, like
Right. Right.
absolutely horrendous. But one of the useful things about deconstructing his writing and then deconstructing someone like Tolkien and talking about the differences in their authorial intent is that if I'm a learner or I'm somebody who's just trying to make sense of a given world, well, now I can use those contrasting cases to create new worlds
Yeah.
that critique
Exactly.
the old worlds.
Exactly.
Like, and thinking
Exactly.
specifically about HBO's Lovecraft Country, which is explicitly anti-racist as a response to H.P. Lovecraft, right? And
Right.
there's this
Right.
opportunity in deconstructing these structures and substructures to talk about those things and have a dialectic through whatever the production you're doing is, whether you're
Right.
designing media, digital media, games, television,
Right.
text,
Right.
whatever, academic work, that you are having this conversation and saying, I am not just an idle passerby who is accepting into myself as some sort of vessel
This is the way it goes.
world
Yeah.
as it is, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be that way. And I think
Right.
this is one of the things that I tried to impress upon my students when I was still teaching is that the point of this is not for me to tell you you have to believe in a specific kind of world.
Right.
You need
Right.
to think about what
You-
action am I taking to make a specific world. And
Yeah.
that's scary. It's one of those things that's as Uncle Ben said in Spider-Man, right? Like that with great power comes great responsibility.
Right.
And I think that's really what I'm trying to emphasize to those learners is I am empowering you to understand the world as complex and nuanced. What you do after you leave my classroom, I can't control, but I want to give you the full
Right.
understanding of what power you wield and so that hopefully you will do it responsibly and you'll
Right.
try to build a world that is better than the one you were born into. And
Right.
I
Right.
can't tell you what better means. I can't tell you how you should approach that problem. I can't tell you how within some discipline in which I am not an expert what
Right.
that looks like. But it is an opportunity for you, regardless of whether or not you're doing this in the context of physics or in the context of the humanities or in the context of music or whatever domain of interest you have.
Right.
And what does that look like? And what actions, concrete actions, you are going to take to manifest that reality? And I
Right.
think,
I was going to say that this is always the thing that I come back with this whole question of privilege. Now, I was born into the world. I had no control over any of these things, just like nobody has control over any of these things. But with the structures and substructures of the United States in 1974, when I was born, I happened to be born into a position of relative privilege, right? So we get into this, I think you said the other day when we were talking, or the other episode, the zero-sum game, right? Now, if I have the privilege of not being pulled over by the cops because of my skin color, that is a privilege that I want not taken from me. I want it extended equally to everyone. Everyone should have that privilege, right? And the funny thing is, it doesn't cost you anything, right? The only thing it
Hmm.
costs you is getting people to think about things in a different way. So that's what, and I think too that even as someone who's holding a position of, relative power in society or whatever, college professor, blah, 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 I'm always trying to think, how can I help empower people who maybe don't have those same kinds of
Yeah.
resources, right? That is always in the forefront of my mind. I am sure that I get it wrong a lot, but I respect it when people say, "Hey, look, you got that wrong." You know what I mean? Or I could, I mean, even I would imagine over the course of these episodes, I've probably said things that have rubbed people the wrong way. And I'd love, and again, like this is the open dialogue. If I really hose something up or need to understand things in a different way, right? Or like, oh no,
Hmm.
what you've read is not actually that has been replaced with this new theory, right? Then like that's part of the conversation that as an academic and as a human being, I want to be a part of. Because one of the things that I was thinking about when you were talking too, and I have tried to find this article because it was really profound. It was on shame, and it was on college composition specifically, about how, and it ties right back into empathy. And I'm thinking about myself as a 18-year-old kid who went to college, right? And it's like didn't have, the only black people in Green Bay at that time, we all assumed were Packers, right? We didn't see a whole lot of them, right? Whatever. So it's like you're going into an area now and into a city that is more diverse, and you're talking and you're thinking about these things, right? And I just think about what a knucklehead I was when I first got there, particularly in terms of gender, but I'm sure I had all kinds of racist stuff in the back of my head too that I just never questioned or thought about, right? So if you in a classroom, this is what this article was saying, is if you use shame as the vehicle, if I say something that is unintentional or even intentionally sexist or racist as a comment in a class about women should just be barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen, or whatever you want to have, right? If the instructor shames me into feeling like I should not have said that, the chances of me going on 4chan or Reddit and finding a
Yeah.
toxic community goes way up. If
Hmm.
they say, does anybody have anything to say about that? And one of the young women says, I find that entirely insulting. You are telling me, you're taking it like you're just saying, you're taking away my choice. And the other option is, well, what if you were a woman? Would you want somebody telling you to do that, right? And that's where you're like, hey, look, just think about it. I don't think anybody in the room agreed with that comment that you made. Some people may have been offended by it. So just think about that, right? Is that the kind of person you
Hmm.
want to be? Is that how you want to be in the world, right? And that is the thing that you plant that seed, and you got to have faith that over time people see, yeah, I'm starting to see this now, right? And this is exactly
Hmm.
specifically with the gender. I took that gender studies class, and I'm like, oh, now that I've dialed it in, I can see this happening all over the place, right? And this is where it's
Well,
not
and
it's not indoctrination, right? It's not that you have to
it's
read these
not.
things. It's like, have you ever thought about noticing these things? Or what if you were in that person's position? Would you rather be in that person's position than your position? And the answer is almost always in those situations, no. That person is getting
Hmm.
screwed. They are being denied something just for something that they have no control over, and that's wrong, right? And it's like the more you
Hmm.
start seeing that, and that's where, again, the idea isn't, if you're teaching them critical thinking, the indoctrination is not that, you need to read Marx and then go out and do these things. It's like, you should be really dissatisfied. If you care about equality, you should be really dissatisfied with the institutional structures that we have in our world, and trying
Hmm.
to figure out how can we make this more equal, more equitable, right? And then it's funny because then once you attend to those things like crime start dropping, right? It's like it's
Hmm.
so anyway, go ahead. What do you, and we should probably get going because it's
Yeah, just to round that off, and I actually think this ends up being a really great segue into our next episode, which is all about demographics, right? We're
right.
going to be talking about demographics and how individuals in a world are accounted for, whether they're in the majority or minority, or how they are fluidly between those things, depending on the context you're talking about. Contrasting your example with going to college with, all these sort of misogynist elements of community practice that had sort of been imposed upon you that then inform the way you think about it. Not only are there a lot of our students that have had these things happen to them, or all of them in various capacities.
Yeah.
Like I grew up in a pretty, I would say, open-minded with respect to LGBTQ issues family, but I had openly gay family members from the 19 for the day I was born. Like that was never abnormal to me. But the way religion was inflected through my life left me with a lot of internalized homophobia. And now, as an adult, and having gone through this process of learning about the world and learning how to make these things visible to me in a
Right.
way they
Right.
hadn't been before, like I had to work through all of that. And in some sense, this is therapeutic. Like I actually
Right.
find it helpful to help me understand the world I'm in and where my place is in it, and to come to terms with my own identity, which is genderqueer and bisexual and like all of these other things that I didn't even have language for when
Right.
I was 18
Exactly.
years old, that
Exactly.
now I can look back on, and it's like oh, now so many things make so much more sense about my life, about how I view myself, about gender dysphoria, about all of these other things that I just couldn't label, that I had been told or had impressed upon me, not directly by my family, but sort of as a society, as a
Right.
member of a community that was in rural New England in the 1980s and 90s. Like these are the things that were normalized, and I had to understand not only what had happened to me, but how was I going to act in my capacity as a public figure or as a professor or as a friend or in all these other identities I carry. How was I going to carry myself to make those things more okay for other people who are now growing up in a world that is, I would argue more chaotic than the one I grew up in,
Right.
but in such a way that it will normalize for them that equality is good,
Yeah.
actually. Like
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
and so, like I said, we can talk about this in the next episode.
I know, right?
think
It's
there's
gonna.
a rich ore to mine on this front, but
Yeah.
like
Exactly.
yeah, I look forward to that conversation, and I hope all of you who have stuck with us through all of this will think too about the various ways this stuff is inflected in your own lives, and to some extent, like if you're going to do this with your own students, what stories are you going to tell them to
Yeah.
make clear for them
Yep.
what the purpose of this is? Like, do you just have them listen to this podcast, or do you kind of share a little bit of your own journey to some of these realizations and the benefits you have accrued as a result of thinking about the world in this nuanced way? And
Yeah.
maybe that's where we leave it. I don't
I
know.
am not going to try and top that because that was
Okay,
that was your moment. So
I'll take it. I'll
you
take
owned
it.
it. You owned
So,
it.
in that spirit, let's cut it there, and we will talk to you all next time about demographics.
All right. Thank you very much, Steve. It was a good conversation as always, and we will do it again soon.
See you later, folks.
The Worldbuilding Workshop podcast is a production of Trent Hergenrader and Steven Slota. Our theme song, Stompin' at Midnight, is a copyright-free Creative Commons production created by composer Kevin MacLeod. The show is mixed and edited by Steven Slota. The companion text, The Worldbuilding Workshop, Teaching Critical Thinking and Empathy Through World Modeling, Simulation, and Play, is published by the MIT Press, copyright 2025. Print copies can be purchased through the MIT Press website. The audiobook version, narrated by Steven Slota, is available at www.theworldbuildingworkshop.com.